A disabled girl was mocked by a famous pianist, until Big Shaq stepped in and shocked everyone. In a world where arrogance meets raw talent, a famous pianist's cruelty echoes through a silent concert hall, until Big Shaq, a towering presence from an entirely different stage, arrives. The stage isn't just set for a clash of music and ego, it's the arena where dignity, truth, and resilience collide. This is no ordinary performance. This is a defiance rising against every snide remark and crushing expectation. And when Big Shaq's resolve enters the scene, even the walls tremble with anticipation. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The hush inside Ellington Concert Hall was not born of reverence, but of something colder, a watchful anticipation, poised like a predator about to pounce. The towering chandeliers cast splintered light down onto the stage, illuminating the solitary figure of Samantha Linwood at the grand piano. She was a picture of poise, seated in her sleek wheelchair, back straight, dark eyes focused on the immaculate ivory keys. Her gown shimmered under the lights, but the shimmer was thin armor against the unspoken judgments thickening the air around her. Every breath she took was deliberate, a silent act of defiance in a room that seemed almost to demand her collapse. In the second row, a scattered murmur pulsed among the audience. A well-dressed woman in a velvet shawl whispered to her companion, her voice a hiss of sympathy laced with derision. "Poor girl. So brave to try, isn't she?" The companion's thin lips curved into a smile that was more grimace than kindness. Behind them, a portly man in a tailored suit checked his watch with exaggerated impatience, while further back, a teenager smirked, nudging his friend as if Samantha's presence alone were a punchline to a joke. But most of the audience simply sat, waiting to see what she would do, waiting to see if she would prove them right. From stage right, Lucian Drexler emerged, as though conjured from shadow itself. His suit was a study in precision, black as a raven's wing, the cut sharp enough to wound. His shoes gleamed under the stage lights, and the air seemed to draw taut as he approached, each step measured to echo just enough for the acoustics of the hall to carry. The quiet cruelty in his smile was almost invisible, the barest lift of a corner of his mouth, but it radiated disdain as palpably as if he had spat at her feet. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he stood just beyond Samantha's line of sight, a dark silhouette against the luminous curve of the piano. The silence stretched, turning brittle. The audience shifted, breaths shallow, the unspoken question thick in the air. Would she play? Could she play? Then, Lucian's voice cut through the stillness like a scalpel. Soft, cultured, but threaded with barbed wire. A remarkable sight, isn't it? His words floated out, coated in a faux gentleness that barely masked the scorn beneath. A young woman, so determined. It's inspiring, really. His gaze swept over the audience, pausing just long enough to capture the uncertain smirks and hesitant nods of those eager to align themselves with his amusement. But of course, the world of music is not built on determination alone, is it? It requires something more, something. He tilted his head, feigning thoughtfulness, though his voice sharpened with each syllable. Adequate. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd, a ripple of discomfort. A few murmured protests, but no one moved. No one stopped him. Samantha's hands, which had hovered above the piano keys, trembled almost imperceptibly before she steadied them. Her eyes remained fixed forward, her expression carved from something cold and distant, though beneath it a storm churned, silent and searing. She did not look at Lucy. She did not look at the audience. Instead, she stared into the piano, as if its polished surface might offer her refuge, or answers, or simply the strength to endure. Lucian took a single step closer, his shadow merging with hers on the stage. "Tell me, Samantha," he murmured, his voice low enough that only those in the front rows might catch the words, but with a clarity that made them ring out like accusations. "Do you really believe that sympathy will carry you through a performance? That the world will applaud your courage while ignoring the notes?" A tense laugh, dry and humorless, slithered from the audience's rear. Lucian's smile deepened. "No one expects miracles, my dear. We expect music. Excellence. Precision. Artistry. And as we all know," his tone was silk-wrapped steel, "those are not things one can simply wish into being." Samantha's fingers curled tightly against her lap. The muscles in her jaw clenched, the only outward sign of the storm rising within her. She had known this moment was coming from the moment she'd wheeled herself onto this stage, from the moment she had accepted this invitation to perform in front of an audience primed to see her fail. But the reality of it, The weight of Lucian's condescension, the suffocating silence of a room filled with strangers pretending not to be complicit, pressed against her ribs like a vice. She thought of the endless hours she had practiced, the time she'd played until her wrists ached and her shoulders burned, the time she'd wept in frustration, not because she couldn't play, but because no one would let her. She thought of the nights she had listened to recordings in the dark, dreaming of stages like this one, of the sound of her own music filling such a space. But most of all, she thought of the quiet voice inside her that had always said, "They will never let you. They will never believe you belong here." Lucian stepped back, his parting words a careless dagger. "Perhaps, next time, Samantha." The audience shifted, a collective exhalation as if the tension had broken, but it was an uneasy release. A few clapped politely, others exchanged uncertain glances, while many simply sat, waiting to see if she would respond. But Samantha remained silent, her hands, still trembling faintly, dropped from the keys. The spotlight above her seemed to sharpen, isolating her further, the brilliance of the light almost mocking in its glare. A low murmur swelled from the back rows, the beginnings of a conversation sparked not by the music that was meant to fill the air, but by the spectacle of humiliation they had witnessed. Someone coughed, a dry sound that echoed louder than intended. A man near the aisle rose, as if preparing to leave, the creak of his chair an unsettling punctuation to the silence that clung to the hall. Samantha's gaze, which had been fixed on the piano, finally shifted, just a fraction, just enough to acknowledge the space beyond the stage, the eyes that had watched her, judged her, pitied her. But there was no defiance in her face, only a weary quiet resolve, as though she were cataloging each face, each silent witness to this moment, and storing them away for something she could not yet name. Lucian turned sharply on his heel, his shoes clicking smartly against the stage floor, as he exited without another glance. His departure was as precise and calculated as his entrance had been, leaving behind a vacuum of sound, an absence that seemed almost louder than his presence. The audience's murmurs grew louder, voices rising in speculative tones, tinged with awkward laughter and clumsy attempts at levity. Samantha remained alone at the piano, her figure still, her breathing slow and deliberate. The stage lights continued to blaze down upon her, but she felt no warmth from them, only the cold weight of exposure, of being laid bare before an audience that saw not her talent, not her humanity, but the performance of a girl who had dared to believe she could be more than their expectation. After what felt like an eternity, Samantha's hands lifted once more, not to play but to rest lightly on the closed lid of the piano. She exhaled softly, a breath that barely stirred the air, and then with a quiet grace that defied the weight pressing down upon her, she turned her wheelchair away from the instrument and began to move toward the wings of the stage. Her movements were fluid, controlled, though her heart raced with the bitter taste of humiliation. She kept her head high, her shoulders straight, and as she disappeared into the shadows at stage left, the murmurs of the audience swelled, a wave of speculation and uncertainty crashing behind her. In the dimness beyond the stage, Samantha paused, her hand resting lightly on the cool, unyielding wall. Her breath trembled, her pulse a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, but she did not allow herself the luxury of collapse. Not here, not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes, the echo of Lucian's voice reverberating in her mind, and vowed silently that this moment, this quiet cruelty played out before an audience too complicit to intervene, would not be her ending. It would be her beginning. In the weeks following the quiet humiliation at Ellington Concert Hall, the city's cultural underbelly hummed with whispers. Samantha Linwood, the disabled pianist whose performance had ended in silence, became a symbol not of triumph, but of exclusion, a silent casualty of an industry that prized perfection over truth. The video of Lucian Drexler's cutting remarks, captured by an attendee's discreet recording, had gone viral within hours, igniting debates that veered between sympathy and scorn. Some defended Lucian's right to maintain artistic standards, others decried his elitism and cruelty. But through it all, Samantha remained silent, her voice absent from the storm, her presence shrinking to the confines of her small apartment, overlooking the city's sprawling skyline. Her world became one of hushed practice sessions behind drawn curtains. She played with the same intensity that had once filled concert halls, but now the music felt different, hesitant, uncertain, as though her fingers no longer trusted the keys. The piano, once her sanctuary, became a battlefield where self-doubt waged a quiet war against determination. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in tighter each day, the weight of Lucian's words pressing down like an invisible hand. Outside, the world moved on, but inside, time stood still, marked only by the steady tick of her metronome, and the soft notes that fell like raindrops into an empty room. Across town, in a sunlit loft that bore no resemblance to the shadowed concert halls of Samantha's world, Big Shaq leaned back in a leather armchair, watching the same viral video play out on a massive screen. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of quiet fury and contemplative sadness. The Shaquille O'Neal who once dominated courts with towering rebounds and larger-than-life charisma, now observed the world with a different lens, one shaped by years of seeing talent overlooked and voices silenced. He wasn't a musician, but he understood the language of exclusion, the subtle codes that dictated who belonged and who didn't. And as he watched Samantha's poised figure absorb the humiliation without a word, something shifted behind his eyes. Later that evening, he made a few calls, quiet, discreet inquiries, through connections built over years. The name Samantha Linwood surfaced repeatedly, each mention tinged with pity or skepticism. To some, she was a promising talent whose ambition exceeded her reach. To others, a naive idealist tilting at an unyielding windmill. But Shaq heard something else. A pattern, a recurring story of walls built to keep out the other, whether that meant the physically disabled, the unconventional, or simply those who refused to conform. He wasn't about to let that pattern continue unchecked. Meanwhile, Lucian Drexler stood at the apex of his world, untouchable and unrepentant. In public, he maintained his veneer of cultured refinement, offering carefully curated statements to the media about preserving artistic integrity and upholding standards in an evolving industry. His words were rehearsed, polished to gleaming perfection, and the media lapped them up. In private, however, Lucian seethed. The viral video had tarnished his image, however slightly, and he despised the notion of being painted as a villain. He convinced himself it was Samantha's fault for daring to challenge the natural order, for thinking she could leverage her circumstances into sympathy and applause. His frustration twisted into a quiet resolve. He would not allow this to disrupt his reign. At a private gathering in an upscale gallery, walls adorned with abstract art, glasses filled with imported wine, Lucian found himself surrounded by admirers and allies. They whispered assurances, reaffirmed his place atop the classical hierarchy, and dismissed the Samantha incident as an unfortunate but insignificant distraction. Yet beneath their platitudes lurked a subtle unease. The incident had sparked discussions that none of them wished to engage with openly, about accessibility, inclusivity, and the changing face of the arts. Conversations they dismissed as trendy politics, but which gnawed at the edges of their control. Shaq, meanwhile, arrived at Samantha's building unannounced one afternoon, his frame filling the narrow corridor as he knocked gently at her door. Samantha, startled by the unexpected visitor, hesitated before unlocking it. She recognized him instantly. Who would? But her guarded expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. Shaq's voice, deep and unexpectedly gentle, filled the space between them. "Mind if I come in?" She stepped aside, her movements wary but polite, and led him into the modest living room, where her piano stood near a window. The sunlight streaming in through the curtains caught the dust motes in the air, turning them into tiny, swirling galaxies. Shaq glanced at the piano, then back at Samantha, his gaze steady. "I saw what happened at Ellington. I saw what they did." Samantha's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though bracing for more pity disguised as encouragement. But Shaq surprised her. He didn't offer platitudes or hollow reassurances. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice low, but charged with quiet intensity. "You got guts, more than most people I know. But guts don't mean much if you're stuck fighting the same battle alone." She met his eyes, her own dark and guarded. But something flickered there, a spark of curiosity perhaps, or a sliver of hope. "What are you saying?" she asked softly. "I'm saying," Shaq replied, his tone both firm and inviting, "that I've been where you are. Not in music, sure, but in a world that tells you where you're allowed to stand and how high you're allowed to reach. I'm saying I've seen what happens when good people get boxed out because they don't fit some narrow idea of who belongs. And I'm saying," he paused, his gaze unwavering, "you don't have to do this alone." The words hung in the air, weighty and unexpected. For a long moment, Samantha said nothing, her thoughts swirling like the dust in the sunlight. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. From that moment, a quiet alliance formed between them, one built not on saviorhood, but on solidarity. Shaq didn't offer her a ready-made plan or a golden ticket to redemption. Instead, he offered his presence, his connections, and his unwavering belief in her talent. He arranged for her to access rehearsal spaces, away from prying eyes, spaces where she could rediscover her sound without the weight of scrutiny. He introduced her to allies in the industry, composers, performers, even patrons, who shared a vision of inclusivity and innovation. As Samantha's confidence rekindled, so too did Lucian's resolve to quash it. He orchestrated subtle barriers, cancelled auditions, quiet warnings to venues, whispered insinuations about her instability. His public face remained polished, but behind closed doors, he tightened his grip on the gatekeeping apparatus that had long kept the classical world insular and exclusive. Yet, with each move he made, Samantha and Shaq countered with quiet determination, building not just a comeback but a statement. Their journey was not without setbacks. Samantha faced skepticism, even from those who sympathized with her plight, many of whom saw her as a symbol rather than an artist in her own right. Shaq navigated circles that were polite but resistant, where offers of support often came with caveats and conditions. But together they forged a path forward, one note, one connection, one performance at a time. The stakes were clear. This was no longer just about Samantha's dream of playing on the world's stages. It was about challenging a system that rewarded conformity and punished difference. About redefining the boundaries of excellence to include not just the privileged few, but the diverse many. It was about proving through persistence and solidarity that talent knows no gate, and that the music born of struggle carries a power that cannot be silenced. As Samantha prepared for her next performance, a small private recital, arranged through Shaq's network, the tension between past humiliation and emerging hope coiled within her like a taut string. The stakes were high, the risks palpable, but for the first time, she felt something she hadn't known since that fateful night at Ellington Hall. She felt ready. The night following Samantha's silent humiliation at Ellington Concert Hall, the world outside her small apartment seemed to hum with a frequency she couldn't quite grasp. It was as though the air itself vibrated with something inevitable, something quietly relentless. She had left the stage with her dignity intact, but her soul bruised, her steps toward the wings steady but weighted. Back in her apartment, the piano remained untouched, the keys white and expectant beneath the faint glow of the city lights streaming through her window. Samantha sat on the edge of her sofa, her phone in hand, as though waiting for it to buzz with news of her downfall. For hours it remained still, the screen dark, offering her a fragile illusion of silence. But silence was never meant to last. At first it was a message from a classmate she barely remembered. "Hey, is this you? Saw a vid. Can't believe it." Then another, from a former teacher dripping with faux concern. "Such a shame, really. Hope you're okay." By the time Samantha opened her social media feed, her name had already begun to fracture into digital echoes. A grainy video, recorded from the third row, captured Lucian's venomous monologue and her poised silence, and it had spread like wildfire. Within hours, hashtags bloomed. Sympathy not talent, Ellington disgrace, Linwood humiliation. Opinion pieces, hastily written and tinged with outrage or thinly veiled scorn, popped up across platforms. Anonymous commenters dissected her every gesture, her expression, her silence, as though her worth as an artist could be distilled into a few seconds of shaky footage. Samantha's pulse raced as she scrolled through the flood of commentary. Some voices rallied to her side, calling out Lucian's elitism and cruelty, but others twisted her story into a cautionary tale. A girl who had dared to dream too big, a symbol of misguided ambition. She read one comment that bit deeper than the rest. If she really loved music, she'd have played through it. Real talent rises above pity. The words felt like a slap, sharp and undeniable. Her hands trembled, and for a fleeting moment, she considered deleting her profiles, severing the thread that tethered her to a world eager to watch her crumble. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she closed her eyes, the glow of the screen burning against her lids, and let the weight of the world press in, until her breath came shallow and quick. Across the city, Lucian Drexler watched the uproar unfold with a mixture of irritation and calculated indifference. The video's virality had caught him by surprise, but his instinct for control was too sharp to let it unsettle him. In interviews granted the next morning, he deflected questions with practiced ease, lamenting the sensationalism of social media and the misunderstanding of artistic integrity. He insisted that his comments had been taken out of context, twisted by those eager fuel a controversy. I have always believed in the highest standards of excellence, he told a polished interviewer, his voice smooth and unwavering. I regret that this incident has been misinterpreted as anything other than a commitment to the art. His words were artful in their own way, calculated to soothe and deflect. Yet behind the closed doors of his penthouse, Lucian's mask slipped. He paced his study, fingers drumming against the polished mahogany desk, eyes flickering to his phone each time a new headline appeared. He hated the way the narrative had shifted, hated the faint but undeniable undercurrent of sympathy swelling around Samantha's name. It was a distraction, an inconvenience, and he resolved to crush it before it could gain momentum. Quietly, he reached out to contacts, editors, patrons, fellow gatekeepers, sowing seeds of doubt, ensuring that Samantha's name would carry the weight of controversy rather than triumph. Meanwhile, Samantha withdrew. She canceled her lessons, ignored her phone calls, let emails pile up unanswered. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the distant hum of city life outside her window and the soft accusing silence of her piano. She felt as though she were dissolving, her edges blurring, her presence shrinking to fit the narrow confines of her shame. Each time she considered playing, the memory of Lucian's words echoed louder, his disdain curling around her like smoke. Even Big Shaq's messages, kind, steady check-ins that never demanded a response, remained unread. She was not ready to face his belief in her, not when she couldn't muster any belief of her own. But the world was not content to let her fade quietly. The controversy only grew. A leaked email surfaced, an internal message from a prominent conservatory, where Lucian served as a guest lecturer, subtly warning staff to exercise caution in professional engagements with Miss Linwood, due to recent events. The email's authenticity was disputed, but the damage was done. Samantha's name became a touchstone in debates about merit versus representation, excellence versus inclusion. Columnists and influencers took sides, their voices rising in a cacophony that drowned out Samantha's own silence. Then, almost without warning, a shift occurred. It was sparked not by a celebrity endorsement or a viral hashtag, but by an unexpected performance. A young violinist named Marisol Reyes, who interrupted her own live-streamed recital to speak directly to the camera. Her voice trembled with emotion as she said, "I watched what happened to Samantha Linwood. I've seen it before, in different forms, in this industry, that tells us who deserves to be heard. I'm done staying silent." The clip was raw, unscripted, and within hours it was everywhere. Others followed, singers, composers, even a few high-profile patrons, lending their voices to a growing chorus that questioned the structures Lucian had spent decades fortifying. Samantha, still ensconced in her apartment, watched these ripples unfold, with a mixture of disbelief and dread. She had not asked for this. She had not sought to become a symbol, a rallying point for a movement she hadn't even had the strength to join. And yet, her name was now inextricably linked to something larger than herself, a struggle for recognition, for respect, for a reimagining of what it meant to belong in a world that had always tried to keep people like her out. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. One evening, as twilight painted her walls in shades of violet and gold, Samantha found herself seated once more at the piano. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and disuse, but her fingers, though hesitant, found the key. She played a single trembling note, then another, each sound tentative but deliberate. It was not a melody yet, not even a fragment of a song, but it was a beginning. She let the notes echo into the quiet, her pulse syncing with the vibrations of the instrument, her breath steadying with each touch of the keys. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from Shaq lighting up the screen. "Whenever you're ready, I'm here." The words were simple, unadorned, and they anchored her in a way she hadn't expected. She set the phone aside without replying, her gaze returning to the piano. The question that had loomed over her for days, "Will you fight back, or be broken by this?" was no longer theoretical. It pulsed beneath her skin, whispered in the quiet between notes. For the first time, she didn't flinch from it. She wasn't ready yet to stand before an audience, wasn't ready to reclaim the spotlight. But she was ready to begin, on her own terms, in her own space, with her own music. And that, she realized, was the first true defiance. Samantha felt trapped between the world's rising expectations and her own gnawing self-doubt. The pity she glimpsed in the commentary swirling online was suffocating. But the harsh criticism cut deeper. Strangers debated her worth as though she were a theoretical problem to be solved. Was she a brave symbol of resilience, or a deluded dreamer too fragile to handle the industry's harsh truths. Each argument scraped at her composure. Each headline chipped away at the fragile resolve she had carried into Ellington Hall. The question pulsed beneath every cruel comment, every well-meaning but clumsy message. Was she an artist, or was she just an emblem of the system's failure? And the worst part, the part she couldn't bear to admit, was that she didn't know the answer. One afternoon, as she sat listlessly on the edge of her sofa, her phone buzzed with a persistent, almost stubborn rhythm. The caller ID flashed a name she hadn't expected. Shaquille O'Neal. She hesitated, the weight of embarrassment heavy in her chest. She hadn't replied to his earlier texts, hadn't answered his calls, hadn't wanted to face the kindness she knew would be in his voice. But the buzzing continued, steady and patient, until finally, with a trembling hand, she picked up. "Hey Samantha," came Shaq's deep voice, rich and calm, yet edged with something almost playful. "I figured you might still be screening my calls. You gonna let me talk this time? Or should I start reciting Shakespeare until you hang up?" Despite herself, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of Samantha's mouth, but she said nothing, her silence stretching out over the line like a challenge. Shaq sighed, the sound more amused than frustrated. "Listen, I get it. I know what it's like to have the world watching, waiting to see if you'll rise or fall. But I also know that hiding in your apartment and letting the silence win, that's not you. Not the real you." His words struck a nerve, and for a moment Samantha's grip tightened around the phone. "You don't know me," she said, her voice brittle, sharp like cracked glass. "You've seen a few headlines, maybe watched a video, but you don't know what it's like to sit there, to have everyone looking at you like you're a mistake." There was a pause on the line, a silence that felt weighted, intentional. Then Shaq spoke, his voice lower, more serious. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to be you. I don't know what it's like to sit in a wheelchair on a stage and have someone tear you down in front of a room full of people. But I do know what it's like to be told you don't belong. I know what it's like to have people decide you're just a joke, just a novelty, because you're too loud, too big, too different. And I know what it's like to want to disappear because it's easier than fighting back." His words hung between them, resonating with a raw honesty that caught Samantha off guard. She drew a shaky breath, her shoulders curling inward, as if trying to shield herself from his voice. "But I'm not like you," she whispered. "I'm not strong. I'm not enough." "You're more than enough," Shaq said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "But you've got to decide that for yourself. I can't make you believe it. I can't drag you out of that apartment. But I can tell you this. If you stay where you are, if you let Lucian win, then you're not just letting him silence you. You're letting him silence every kid who's ever watched you and thought, if she can do it, maybe I can too." The thought cut deep, slicing through the thick fog of Samantha's doubt. She imagined all the young musicians who might have seen her performance, the ones who had cheered when her name was announced, who had believed in her even when she couldn't. The weight of their silent expectations settled over her, heavy but undeniable. Shaq's voice softened. "You're scared. I get that. But you've got a choice here. You can stay hidden, let them write your story for you. Or you can pick yourself up, step back out and write the ending yourself. I'll be there. I've got your back. But the first step's gotta be yours." Samantha's throat tightened, her pulse drumming in her ears. For a long moment, she said nothing, her mind a swirling chaos of fear and defiance. Then almost imperceptibly, she whispered, "I don't even know where to start." Shaq let out a low, warm chuckle. "That's easy. You start by playing, one note at a time." In the days that followed, Samantha found herself venturing beyond the confines of her apartment for the first time in weeks. Shaq, true to his word, arranged for her to rehearse in a quiet studio space he had access to, a converted warehouse with high ceilings and walls lined with old sports memorabilia and vintage recording equipment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was private, a space where the eyes of the world couldn't reach her. She wheeled herself into the space cautiously, her fingers brushing the familiar surface of her keys, the air thick with the scent of dust and faded ambition. At first the music came haltingly. Her hands hesitated, her mind second-guessed every note. But Shaq was there, seated in a mismatched armchair nearby, his presence a silent reassurance. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice unless she asked. Instead, he listened, really listened, as she worked through scales, broken phrases, fragments of compositions she had abandoned in despair. His nods of encouragement, his occasional murmured, "That's it," or "You've got this," were like lifelines thrown into the turbulent sea of her doubt. And slowly, Almost imperceptibly, the music began to flow. It wasn't flawless, and it wasn't the polished perfection she had once demanded of herself, but it was hers, raw, honest, unfiltered by the expectations of an audience or the scorn of critics. Each note was a reclamation, each chord a small defiance against the narrative Lucian had tried to impose on her. But the internal battle was far from over. There were moments when Samantha would freeze mid-phrase, her hands trembling, her breath catching in her throat as the old doubts surged back. She would hear Lucian's voice echoing in her mind, see the smirks of the audience in her memories, and feel the weight of her own inadequacy pressing down. In those moments, she wanted nothing more than to close the piano, to retreat back into silence. Shaq would wait, patient and steady. When she faltered, he would quietly shift in his chair, his deep voice a grounding presence. "You're not here to be perfect," he reminded her once, his words low and steady. "You're here to be you. Let the music come from that." Those simple words, spoken without flourish or pretense, resonated more deeply than any applause she had ever received. As the days passed, a quiet rhythm took hold. Samantha's rehearsals became less about conquering fear and more about rediscovering the joy of music itself. The walls of the warehouse studio seemed to fade, replaced by the expansive landscapes her music painted. Shaq's presence, his unwavering support, created a space where she could rebuild not just her confidence, but her identity as an artist. Yet, even as she grew stronger, a gnawing fear lingered. She worried that her resurgence was built not on her own merit, but on Shaq's intervention, that she was becoming the very symbol she had dreaded being. One evening, as the city lights flickered beyond the warehouse windows, she voiced this fear aloud. "What if they're right?" she said, her voice barely audible. "What if I'm just their token, their excuse to feel progressive?" Shaq's response was immediate, his voice low but fierce. "You're not their token. You're not anyone's excuse. You're a damn good musician who's had to fight twice as hard to be heard. And if they can't see that, it's their failure, not yours." As she played that night, her music flowed with a new clarity, a fierce honesty that needed no validation. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear: Samantha Linwood was no longer just a symbol. She was a force, and her story was far from over. But here there were no spectators, no whispers threading through gilded balconies, no mocking smirks waiting for her to falter. Here it was just her, the piano, and Big Shaq, who stood nearby with arms crossed, his expression both patient and expectant. Samantha inhaled, a breath that trembled before it settled in her chest. For weeks she'd folded inward, burying her music beneath layers of doubt and humiliation. She'd silenced herself, convinced that her voice had no place in a world eager to dismiss her as a symbol rather than a musician. But Shaq's steady presence, his refusal to let her drown in silence, had chipped away at the walls she'd built around herself. His challenge was simple but profound: return to the music, not to prove anyone wrong, not to perform for a crowd hungry for redemption stories, but to reclaim the essence of who she was. "You ready?" Shaq's voice rumbled softly, his question more invitation than demand. Samantha's hands hovered, trembled, then descended. The first notes were halting, uncertain, but they echoed through the cavernous space, expanding into the shadows like tentative declarations of existence. Each chord was a breath pulled from her chest, each progression a step into unfamiliar territory. The music wasn't polished, wasn't perfect, but it was hers, honest and raw, unfiltered by expectation or fear. Shaq settled into an old folding chair, his large frame dwarfing the fragile structure, and listened. His silence wasn't passive. It was a solid grounding presence that allowed Samantha's music to unfold, to stretch and test its boundaries. When she faltered, he offered no critique, only a subtle nod that said, "Keep going." When she hesitated, he shifted forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze steady, as if willing her to trust herself. Days turned into nights, as Samantha returned, each time pushing herself a little further. The gym became a cocoon of rebirth, the dim light and echoing acoustics a canvas for her re-emerging voice. Shaq had arranged for the space to be secured, free from prying eyes, allowing her to work without the weight of judgment. It was a place where her music could be messy, where failure wasn't a public spectacle but a private lesson. Their routine formed its own rhythm. Samantha would arrive early, warming up with scales that grew more confident with each session. Shaq would appear shortly after, sometimes carrying snacks, always offering a quiet word of encouragement. They would talk in snatches about basketball, about music, about the quiet, invisible battles fought when no one was watching. Shaq shared stories of his own struggles, of the times he'd been dismissed or underestimated, and though his world of sports was different from hers, the undercurrent of defiance and resilience resonated deeply. One evening, after a particularly grueling session where Samantha had wrestled with a piece she once thought beyond her reach, she slumped against the piano, her breath shallow, her fingers sore. "I don't know if I can do this," she murmured, her voice cracking under the weight of exhaustion and doubt. "Maybe Lucian was right. Maybe I'm just trying to prove something that isn't real." Shaq rose from his chair and crossed the space to stand beside her. His hand, large and warm, rested lightly on her shoulder. "Lucian doesn't get to decide what's real for you," he said quietly. "You do. You're not trying to prove anything to him, or to anyone else. You're finding your voice, Sam. That's what this is about." She looked up at him, her dark eyes brimming with frustration, and a flicker of something more resilient. "But what if I fail?" Shaq crouched to meet her gaze, his expression solemn yet steady. "Then you fail forward, but you don't quit. Not because of him. Not because of anyone who thinks you don't belong. You're not here to win his approval. You're here to remind yourself why you started playing in the first place." His words hung in the air, heavy with conviction, and for the first time in weeks, Samantha felt a surge of defiance rise in her chest, not directed at Lucian, not born of anger, but a quiet resolve to reclaim what had been taken from her. She wasn't fighting to prove her worth to the world. She was fighting to rediscover her own truth. The transformation wasn't immediate. There were still days when the music faltered, when self-doubt coiled around her fingers and made the keys feel alien. But there were also moments when the notes flowed freely, when the melodies danced through the air with a clarity and purpose that eclipsed her fears. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Samantha shed the weight of external expectation and reconnected with the sheer visceral joy of creation. Shaq watched her evolution with a mixture of pride and protectiveness. He adjusted the space around her to nurture her growth, installing better lighting, bringing in a battered old metronome that he claimed had belonged to a jazz musician he once admired, setting up recording equipment to capture her progress. He shielded her from inquiries, deflected journalists who sniffed around for a redemption story, and made sure she had the privacy and support she needed to rebuild at her own pace. Word of her return, though carefully controlled, began to seep into the underground circuits of the music world. Whispered rumors of a comeback surfaced at quiet gatherings, fueled by those who'd heard snippets of her playing through the walls of the basement gym, or by those privy to Shaq's confidences. But Samantha refused to let the noise distract her. For her, this wasn't about a comeback. It was about survival, about artistry, about reclaiming a part of herself she'd nearly lost. One evening, as she played a haunting arrangement that melded classical and jazz influences, her music soaring and dipping like a conversation between past and present, she caught a glimpse of Shaq's expression, serious, reflective, and tinged with something akin to awe. When she finished, the final notes lingering like breath on glass, he exhaled deeply. "That," he said, his voice low and reverent, "that's your truth." Samantha's lips curved into a smile, tentative but genuine. "It's messy," she said softly, "but it's mine." He nodded. "The best ones always are." Outside the gym, the world continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the quiet revolution taking place within its walls. Lucian Drexler, sensing the shifting tides, began to tighten his grip on the institutions that had long propped up his authority. He launched subtle campaigns to discredit Samantha's efforts, whispered to influential patrons that her comeback was a manufactured spectacle, orchestrated by Shaq's celebrity. But the more he pushed, the more cracks appeared in his facade. Whispers of dissent spread among younger musicians, whispers of solidarity, whispers that perhaps, finally, the old order was being challenged. Inside the gym, Samantha played on, her fingers weaving stories that spoke not just of her own journey, but of every artist who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. Her music became a quiet rebellion, a declaration that talent could not be confined by gatekeepers, or reduced to symbols. It was raw, it was imperfect, and it was alive. As the final note of her latest piece reverberated into silence, Shaq approached, offering her a bottle of water and a rare unguarded smile. "You're ready," he said simply. Samantha's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "Not for them," she said. "For me." And in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of her own music and the quiet strength of her mentor's belief, Samantha Linwood stepped fully into her new world, not as a victim, not as a symbol but as an artist reclaiming her place in the symphony of life. In the quiet between Samantha's halting practice sessions and the world's swirling noise outside, Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq let traces of his own story slip through the cracks. It wasn't in grand speeches or forced confessions, but in the simple, quiet ways he interacted with her. Over sandwiches during breaks, or when he adjusted the light in the dim basement gym, his words carried subtle hints of battles he'd fought, losses he'd endured, and the journey from being a spectacle to finding peace in his own truth. One evening, after Samantha's fingers stumbled over a complicated passage, and she let out a frustrated sigh, Shaq sat beside her on the bench, his massive presence both grounding and gentle. "You know," he said, his voice low, "back when I started in the league, there were a lot of people who saw me as just muscle. A guy who could dunk but didn't have the brains for the real game. They called me a showboat, said I didn't have discipline. They wrote me off before I even started." Samantha looked at him, her brows knitting together. Curiosity sparked. It was hard to imagine the towering, confident man beside her ever being underestimated, ever dismissed. "I tried to play through it, to prove them wrong," Shaq continued, his gaze distant, as though seeing a younger version of himself. "But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many points I scored or rebounds I grabbed, the whispers didn't stop. I realized I wasn't just fighting to be seen as a player, I was fighting to be seen as a person, not a caricature." He chuckled softly, a sound tinged with something bittersweet. "It took me a long time to figure out that proving them wrong wasn't the point. Proving to myself that I belonged, that was the real battle." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with Samantha, who felt the parallels tug at her own story. The world's gaze, the dismissive comments, the constant need to justify existence. It wasn't just her fight, it was his too. And in that realization, the invisible thread connecting them thickened, stronger and unspoken. They continued working in the basement gym, where Samantha's music evolved, and Shaq's encouragement remained steady. He didn't impose solutions. He let her find her own way through the storm. His role wasn't that of a savior, but of a witness, someone who saw her not as a symbol or a struggle, but as a person capable of reclaiming her own narrative. That simple act of seeing her, not her chair, not her past, but her, was a gift Samantha hadn't known she needed. As their bond deepened, so too did Lucian's arrogance. Out in the polished world of gala dinners and exclusive conservatories, Lucian doubled down on his rhetoric. He appeared on talk shows, his silver tongue framing Samantha's resurgence as a dangerous compromise of standards. His words were calm, his delivery impeccable, but beneath the surface, there was a hint of desperation. "Excellence," he insisted, "cannot be sacrificed for inclusivity. The arts demand the highest caliber of talent, not the indulgence of sentimentality." His statements rippled through the industry, sowing doubt among those on the fence, and reinforcing the prejudices of his staunch supporters. Where Samantha's story grew in quiet resilience, Lucian's narrative hardened into an unyielding wall, cementing his reputation as the gatekeeper who would not yield. Back in the gym, Shaq never mentioned Lucian directly, but his occasional glances at his phone, at headlines flashing Lucian's polished statements, told Samantha he was aware of the battle lines being drawn. Yet he didn't waver. Instead, he shared more of his own past in quiet moments, reinforcing the lessons Samantha was slowly absorbing. "You know what I did when they kept doubting me?" Shaq said one late evening, as Samantha packed up her sheet music. "I stopped trying to make them see me. I started investing in the next generation, the kids who got overlooked, the players who didn't fit the mold. I figured if the system wouldn't change for me, I'd help build a different system for them." Samantha paused, her hands resting lightly on the piano. "That's what you're doing now," she said softly, realization dawning. Shaq's smile was slow, reflective. "Yeah, and I'm not done yet." The contrast between his quiet, steady mentorship and Lucian's public, self-serving declarations was stark. While Lucian orchestrated media narratives and clung to his ivory tower of exclusivity, Shaq invested in the shadows, in the forgotten corners where real talent blossomed unnoticed. His support of Samantha wasn't about publicity. It was about principle. He believed in her not because she could be a headline, but because he recognized a resilience that deserved to be nurtured. The more Samantha saw of Shaq's quiet battles, the more her own resolve solidified. Her music grew bolder, her fear diminished. She realized that every note she played was part of a larger conversation, a refusal to be erased, a declaration that talent wasn't confined to Lucian's narrow definition of excellence. And with each session in that basement gym, she reclaimed a piece of herself that had been fractured by public scorn. Their connection wasn't built on grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It was forged in the quiet spaces between doubt and determination, in the shared understanding of what it meant to be underestimated, and yet to persist. Together they were rewriting not just her narrative, but a challenge to the world that sought to contain voices like hers. And as Lucian's public statements grew increasingly dismissive, tinged with the arrogance of a man who sensed his grip slipping, Samantha's music in the shadows became a rising tide, a quiet rebellion waiting for the right moment to be heard. At first her rehearsals were hesitant, fragmented. The piano resisted her touch, the notes slipping through her fingers like sand. She hesitated, started over, grimaced at her own mistakes. But Shaq never let her spiral into frustration. When her hands froze mid-phrase, he leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and said things like, "You think I was born dunking? You gotta fall a few times to learn the rhythm," his voice rumbling through the space. His anecdotes, half basketball, half life lessons, weren't polished or precise, but they wrapped around her like a safety net, reminding her that imperfection was part of the process. Gradually, the music changed. What had begun as cautious, broken notes stitched together with sheer willpower evolved into something more fluid, more confident. Samantha's fingers danced across the keys with increasing certainty, weaving melodies that carried the scars of her journey, but refused to be defined by them. Her music shifted from replication of classical perfection to a raw, fierce sound that was uniquely hers, less about mimicking the masters and more about telling her own story. Shaq, ever the unconventional coach, occasionally brought in odd props, a basketball he'd dribble lightly in the corner, insisting she sync her rhythm to the bounce, a metronome set to a tempo he claimed matched his free throw routine, a recording of street musicians playing jazz and soul, challenging her to improvise alongside the unfamiliar rhythms. At first she protested, certain it would derail her practice, but over time, the dissonance sparked creativity. The steady beat of the basketball became an anchor, the metronome a pulse that steadied her breathing, the street recordings a reminder that music lived beyond the gilded concert halls. She laughed, sometimes shaking her head at the absurdity, but found herself playing with more freedom than she ever had before. As Samantha's music grew bolder, Lucian Drexler's public dismissals sharpened. He appeared in interviews with the same polished charm, subtly ridiculing what he called a pity project propped up by celebrity sympathy. His comments, veiled as critiques of declining standards, struck chords of doubt in certain circles, but they failed to touch the core of what Samantha and Shaq were building. Lucian's world was one of rigid control, of orchestrated brilliance, while Samantha's was evolving into a symphony of resilience and truth, a narrative that no amount of polished rhetoric could suppress. Shaq never directly addressed Lucian's barbs, but there were moments when Samantha caught his jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing as he read yet another article dripping with condescension. Still, he always returned to her practice sessions with the same unshakable calm. "Let him talk," he'd say. "He doesn't get to write your music, you do." Their sessions extended into the evenings, the fading light casting long shadows across the gym floor. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat and determination, the occasional thud of Shaq's basketball punctuating the lilting notes of the piano. Samantha's pieces became layered with emotion, hope, anger, defiance, all woven into melodies that shifted from classical to contemporary, blending influences in a way that defied categorization. Each day she shed more of the caution that had once bound her, leaning into the music as a language of her own making. One night, as rain pattered against the gym's high windows, Samantha played a piece that began softly, almost like a lullaby, then crescendoed into a fierce, unrelenting rhythm. Shaq stood silently, his arms still crossed, his expression unreadable. When she looked up, breathless and uncertain, he finally spoke. "That," he said quietly, "is who you are. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Samantha felt the truth of his words settle over her, a weight that was not burdensome but grounding. She realized then that her fight wasn't about reclaiming a place in Lucian's world. It was about creating a space where her voice, her truth could resonate without needing permission. The realization sharpened her focus, her playing growing more deliberate, her choices more daring. As word of her evolving sound spread through whispers in the industry, some dismissed it as a novelty, a momentary defiance that would fade. But those who listened closely recognized the shift, a musician shedding the constraints of expectation to embrace a sound born from resilience. Lucian's dismissals rang increasingly hollow against the backdrop of a narrative that refused to be silenced. In the basement gym, Samantha and Shaq continued their unlikely duet, her fingers dancing over the keys, his quiet encouragement, filling the spaces between. The world outside might still be skeptical. Lucian might still wield his influence. But within these walls, a new symphony was taking shape. It was raw, it was real, and it was unstoppable. Samantha sat at the polished grand piano at the room's center, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling just slightly, her breath caught between the desire to flee and the resolve to stay. But when she glanced toward the side of the room and caught sight of Big Shaq standing quietly with his arms crossed, his steady presence anchoring her, something inside her tightened, clicked into place. This was not a stage for redemption in the eyes of critics or Lucian's loyalists. This was her moment to claim, to tell her story in notes that defied expectation. The first notes emerged tentative but clear, threading through the hushed audience. The melody unfolded, not with calculated precision, but with raw honesty, each phrase shaped by the weight of her journey. The room leaned in, drawn by the quiet power rising from the piano. Samantha's fingers gained strength, her touch bold and unapologetic. The piece she had chosen was not one of classical grandeur, but a composition she had crafted in the dim hours of practice, a blend of classical motifs, jazz improvisation, and something unmistakably her own. As the music swelled, the audience was captivated. Conversation ceased, breaths held. The tension in the room coalesced into a collective awareness that they were witnessing not just a performance, but a declaration, a reclamation of voice, of agency, of defiance. Samantha's body, once rigid with anxiety, now moved fluidly with the music, her head tilting, her shoulders releasing their grip, as her playing filled the space with a sound that was hers and hers alone. At the periphery, Lucian Drexler stood, his face a carefully composed mask. He hadn't expected her to rise this far, not after the public humiliation, not after the relentless press coverage, and his quiet campaigns to stifle her resurgence. His lips thinned, his fingers tightening around the program booklet he held, as if trying to control the narrative through sheer force of will. But the notes pouring from the piano were beyond his reach, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his polished features. When Samantha struck the final chord, the silence that followed was not empty, but charged, the air vibrating with something unspoken. For a moment the room was still, as though everyone present needed time to process what they had just witnessed. Then a single pair of hands clapped, hesitant, yet insistent. It was Big Shaq, his applause breaking the spell, his face alight with quiet pride. Others joined in, and soon the room erupted into genuine, sustained applause, some standing, others cheering softly, the walls reverberating with a validation that no critic could scratch. Samantha sat back, her chest rising and falling with the weight of release, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She glanced toward Shaq, who gave her a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that she had done what she came to do. For a fleeting shining moment, she felt the sweet surge of vindication, of being seen and heard on her own terms. Within hours the performance was clipped, uploaded, and shared across social media platforms. Viewers marveled at the raw power of her music, at the courage of her return, at the authenticity that had been missing from so many polished stages. Her name trended globally, not as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol of resilience. Invitations flooded her inbox, interviews were requested, support poured in from unexpected quarters. For the first time since Ellington Hall, Samantha dared to hope. But the tide, as quickly as it rose, carried with it the undertow of resistance. Lucian Drexler, blindsided by the surge of support surrounding Samantha's performance, retaliated with calculated precision. A scathing op-ed appeared the following morning, its tone measured but dripping with veiled disdain. Framed as a defense of artistic integrity, the piece argued that Samantha's return represented a dangerous shift in priorities, a preference for emotional spectacle over technical excellence. Lucian couched his words in language that suggested regret, but the message was clear. Samantha's talent was being exaggerated by a public hungry for feel-good narratives. His closing statement stung like a lash. Let us not allow sentiment to cloud our judgment of true artistry. The op-ed spread rapidly, fanning flames of debate across media platforms. Commentators dissected his arguments, some aligning with his view, others decrying his arrogance. A few who had applauded Samantha's performance now hesitated, caught in the crossfire of opinion. The surge of vindication she'd felt the night before faltered under the weight of public scrutiny. What had seemed like a turning point now felt precarious, the ground beneath her feet shifting once again. Samantha read the op-ed in silence, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly around her phone. The sting of Lucian's words cut deeper than she wanted to admit, reopening the doubts she'd fought so hard to silence. She felt the familiar tug of fear, the urge to withdraw, to protect herself from a world that seemed determined to twist her triumph into a weapon against her. That night, as the city's lights shimmered through her apartment window, Samantha sat at her piano, her fingers brushing the keys. She played not to silence Lucian's voice, but to reaffirm her own, each note a declaration that her journey was not over, that the high point was only the beginning, and that the real confrontation, one that transcended music, was still to come. The euphoria of East Haven Library's applause had barely begun to fade when Samantha Linwood felt the walls close in. What had seemed like a quiet, steady ascent back to herself twisted into a maze of betrayals and doubts, each revelation a sharp fracture in her fragile armor. Invitations that had flooded her inbox in the aftermath of her triumphant performance now slowed, then trickled to a stop. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. Responses became perfunctory, tinged with caution. The silence was familiar, but this time it felt orchestrated, calculated, as though unseen hands were pulling her strings back into place. It was Big Shaq who first noticed the pattern. Sitting with Samantha in the dim basement gym one evening, reviewing her upcoming schedule, he tapped a thick finger against a list of venues. "These names," he said quietly. "They were ready to host you. Now they're hesitating. You feel that?" Samantha nodded, the tight knot in her stomach constricting further. "I thought it was nerves," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now, it feels different." Shaq leaned back, his expression shadowed. "This isn't nerves, Sam. It's pushback. Someone's making calls. Someone's tightening the screws." The truth crystallized in her mind, sharp and undeniable. Lucian. His elegant, veiled attacks weren't limited to op-eds and public statements. His influence reached deeper, threading through the industry's gatekeepers, whispering doubts, reviving old prejudices, and it wasn't just institutions, it was personal. The blow came one afternoon in the form of a phone call, from a family friend, a woman Samantha had trusted since childhood. Her voice was careful, her words rehearsed. "I've been meaning to reach out, Samantha. I know you're busy, but I thought you should hear it from me first." Lucian approached me. He's worried about you. About the pressure you're under. He asked if I might encourage you to reconsider performing for now, for your own good. You understand." Samantha felt the ground shift beneath her, her pulse spiking. "For my own good?" she echoed, her voice sharp. "Just think about it," the woman said softly. "Sometimes it's better to step back before you get hurt." The line went dead, but the damage was done. Samantha sat in silence, her phone heavy in her hand, her heart a cold weight in her chest. Betrayal wasn't just in the headlines or the hesitations of institutions. It was in the voice of someone she had trusted implicitly, someone who should have stood by her. Lucian's reach was deeper than she'd imagined, his manipulation more insidious. Shaq, when she told him, listened with a grim set to his jaw. "This is how they do it," he said quietly. "They don't just shut doors. They make you doubt the ones who are always open. They isolate you, make you think you're alone." Samantha felt the truth of his words settle heavily in her bones. The next days unfolded like a tightening noose. Rumors surfaced, whispers that her comeback was a publicity stunt, orchestrated by Shaq's celebrity pull, that her music lacked true depth. Anonymous sources leaked claims that she was unstable, overwhelmed, unready. She found herself fielding calls from journalists asking pointed, invasive questions about her mental health, her relationship with Shaq, her supposed breakdown after Ellington Hall. Each question was a needle, sharp and deliberate. The smear campaign escalated quietly but relentlessly. An unsigned letter arrived at her apartment, its contents cold and threatening, warning her to know her place and stop playing the victim. Her email inbox filled with veiled threats, messages from faceless senders reminding her that she was being watched, that her every misstep would be magnified. The weight of systemic resistance pressed harder, the silent machinery of exclusion whirring to life, working to crush her momentum before it could truly ignite. Shaq's support never wavered, but even he was not immune to the strain. Late one night, after a long practice session, Samantha found him sitting alone in the corner of the gym, his phone dark on the bench beside him. His hands clasped tightly. His shoulders, usually so broad and steady, were hunched slightly, as though carrying a weight no one else could see. When she approached, he lifted his head, his smile tight and weary. "I knew it wouldn't be easy," he said, his voice low. "But I didn't think they'd play this dirty." Samantha sat beside him, her own exhaustion mirrored in his expression. "It's not just me, is it?" she said softly. "It's anyone who tries to challenge them. Anyone who doesn't fit the mold." Shaq nodded, his gaze distant. "They build the mold. They decide who gets to be in the room. And when you push back, they don't just slam the door, they make sure everyone around you knows the cost of standing by you." For a moment, the weight of their combined battles hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Samantha felt the cracks forming, the quiet despair that threatened to pull her under. But then Shaq straightened, his expression hardening, his voice resolute. "But they can't erase you, Sam. They can't silence the truth you've already told. And they can't break what we're building here, not unless you let them." His words ignited a spark of defiance in her chest, a flicker of strength she clung to like a lifeline. She realized then that the battle wasn't just about her music. It was about her right to exist in a space that had tried to erase her, about her refusal to let Lucian or anyone else dictate her worth. In the days that followed, Samantha and Shaq doubled down, their rehearsals intensified, their preparations meticulous. The smear campaigns continued, the betrayals deepened, but they moved forward with quiet, determined precision. Samantha's music became sharper, more layered, her compositions infused with the weight of resistance and the clarity of purpose. And Shaq, despite his weariness, remained at her side, his quiet presence a shield against the storm raging beyond the gym walls. The weight was immense, the emotional toll undeniable. But with every note Samantha played, with every decision to keep going despite the odds, they carved out a space where the truth of her artistry could not be silenced. It was a war of attrition, a battle fought not with grand gestures but with stubborn persistence. And though the world outside seemed intent on closing in, Samantha and Shaq stood their ground, unbroken, their music rising defiantly above the noise. The op-ed dropped on a rain-slicked Tuesday morning, its headlines stark against the digital backdrop. The tragedy of talentless defiance, when sympathy outpaces skill. Lucian Drexler's byline gleamed beneath it, like a polished dagger. Samantha Linwood sat at her small kitchen table, the screen of her phone glowing with the weight of the words. Her coffee sat untouched, cooling in its cup. Her chest felt hollow, each breath shallow and strained. The piece was crafted with the elegance of a practiced rhetorician, each sentence a precise incision. Lucian spoke of artistic integrity, lamented the erosion of standards, and bemoaned the celebration of mediocrity, cloaked in narratives of struggle. He never named Samantha outright, but the target was clear. He painted her as a symbol of indulgence, a distraction from true artistry, and the public as complicit in elevating a story over skill. It was, he suggested, a cautionary tale of misplaced sentimentality in a world too eager to applaud resilience over excellence. The public reaction was immediate and polarizing. On one side, voices rose in her defense. Musicians, critics, and audiences, who had witnessed her East Haven performance and felt the raw, unfiltered honesty in her music. They spoke of her courage, her authenticity, the undeniable soul of her compositions. On the other, a chorus of skepticism echoed Lucian's words, accusing her of capitalizing on sympathy, of being a manufactured prodigy propped up by a celebrity mentor. Comment sections flooded with vitriol and thinly veiled pity, each comment another stone weighing down her resolve. For days, Samantha avoided the piano. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her hands, feeling the tremor in her fingers, that wasn't from nerves, but from something deeper, an erosion of faith in her own worth. Each time she glanced at the sheet music scattered across her apartment, her mind echoed Lucian's words. A tragedy of talentless defiance. The phrase embedded itself like a shard of glass, refracting every note she had ever played into something tainted, something fraudulent. Big Shaq tried to reach her, his messages growing more insistent. His voice on the phone warm but tinged with quiet concern. "Sam, I know you're hurting," he said one evening, his words muffled through her unanswered call. "But don't let him take this from you. You're more than his words. You're more than what they say." But Samantha couldn't bring herself to answer. Her apartment felt suffocating, the walls pressing in with each headline, each rehashed opinion piece dissecting her performance, her motives, her very right to stand on a stage. She thought of the family friend's betrayal, of the whispers in the industry, of the quiet phone calls that had stopped coming. She thought of the music she had once found joy in, now twisted into a weapon wielded against her by those who had never heard her true voice. One evening, long after the city lights had bled into a blur against the night sky, Samantha found herself at the piano. She sat in silence, her fingers hovering just above the keys, her breath trembling. She pressed one note, soft, tentative, but the sound felt foreign, distant. She pressed another, a hollow echo. The melody she had once trusted to carry her forward felt unreachable now, a language she no longer understood. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and silent, blurring the keys until they became an indistinct smear of black and white. Her hands dropped to her lap, her shoulders slumping forward under the weight of invisible pressure. Maybe Lucian was right, she thought bitterly. Maybe I was just a story people wanted to believe, not a musician worth listening to. The thought hollowed her out, left her adrift. The fight that had once driven her, fueled by defiance and Shaq's steady encouragement, seemed like a distant echo, fading into the relentless tide of doubt. She wondered if she should step back, disappear quietly, let the noise die down. It would be easier, less painful to fade into obscurity than to continue standing under a spotlight that magnified her every flaw, every hesitation. But then, as she sat in the dim light, her phone buzzed softly on the table. Another message from Shaq. She almost ignored it, but something, perhaps the last thread of her own stubbornness, made her glance at the screen. His message was simple, unadorned, but it cut through the fog of her despair like a sharp, clean note. Don't let his story be louder than your truth. The words lingered in her mind, fragile yet insistent. She closed her eyes, letting the message echo against the walls of her doubt. The silence stretched long, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city beyond her window. The tears slowed, her breathing steadied. She wasn't ready to play, not yet. The weight of Lucian's words still pressed against her, the split public reaction a constant drumbeat of uncertainty. But beneath it all, a tiny ember of defiance flickered. She wasn't done.
Not yet.
Break into 3. Final resolve. The invitation arrived in an envelope, as understated as it was unexpected. Samantha Linwood found it resting on her doorstep late one evening, the embossed card bearing only the faintest hint of gold at the edges. She turned it over in her hands, the weight of the paper strangely grounding. Inside, the message was clear: an exclusive recital at Ellington Hall, hosted by a circle of elite patrons and major figures from the arts community. The note was formal, its language precise, but the implication was unmistakable. This was not an open invitation. It was a test stage held out not as a gift, but as a gauntlet. Samantha read the words twice, her pulse thrumming with a complex knot of emotions. This was the very stage where her silence had once been orchestrated, where Lucian's carefully sharpened words had nearly broken her. Now it was calling her back, not as a supplicant, but as an artist summoned to reclaim her space. Her first instinct was to reject it, to walk away from a stage that had once been a crucible of humiliation. But as she traced her finger along the invitation's edge, she felt the simmering pulse of defiance rise within her. In the stillness of her apartment, she sat at the piano, the keys cool under her fingertips. The memory of Lucian's op-ed still stung, his words echoing with cold precision, but they were no longer the only voice in her mind. The applause at East Haven, the quiet, steady encouragement of Big Shaq, the fragments of her own music woven with pain and resilience, all of it surged forward, louder than his condemnation. Her hands hovered over the keys, her breath steady. She didn't need the invitation to prove herself to Lucian, or to the world. She needed it for herself, for every silent voice that had never been given a chance to speak. Her decision was made. When she called Shaq that night, his voice was rough with sleep, but softened with warmth. "You got something on your mind, Sam?" he asked, his tone laced with quiet understanding. "I'm going to play," she said, the words emerging stronger than she felt. "At Ellington. But not for them. For me. For everyone they tried to silence." There was a beat of silence, and then his voice, low and proud. "That's my girl." In the days that followed, the gym became a flurry of preparation. Shaq arranged for the piano to be tuned to perfection, its surface polished to a quiet sheen that caught the light filtering through the narrow windows. He cleared space for her music sheets, brought in a battered old speaker that played her favorite records during breaks, and stocked the fridge with snacks that he claimed were his personal training staples. Their routine tightened, their focus sharpening as the date approached. Samantha's rehearsals shifted from hesitant exploration to deliberate mastery. Her fingers, once tentative, now danced with a confidence born not of perfection but of authenticity. Each note was infused with the layered history of her struggle, the early lessons, the quiet dismissals, the public scorn, and finally the resurgence of her own voice. Her compositions blended classical elegance with raw emotion, weaving together fragments of jazz, soul and improvisation that defied easy categorization. She wasn't just preparing to perform, she was crafting a narrative that could not be muted. Shaq watched her with a steady gaze, offering guidance when needed, but more often simply standing back to let her music fill the space. He brought his own stories to their sessions, memories of games played under crushing pressure, of moments when he'd been written off, dismissed as nothing more than a showman. His tales were unpolished, filled with humor and humility, but threaded through them was a quiet wisdom that resonated deeply with Samantha's journey. On the evening before the recital, as Samantha closed her sheet music and stretched her tired fingers, Shaq approached her with a small box in hand. "Got something for you," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. She took the box, her brow furrowing in curiosity. Inside lay a metronome, old but polished, its surface engraved with faint initials and a series of dates. "This belonged to a musician I knew," Shaq explained, his gaze distant for a moment. "He gave it to me when I was trying to figure out my own rhythm, on and off the court. Told me it wasn't just about keeping time, it was about finding your own pace, your own heartbeat, no matter what the world tried to throw at you." Samantha ran her fingers over the metronome's smooth surface, feeling the weight of its history, the echo of stories passed down through silent beats. She looked up, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Shaq shrugged, but his smile was quietly proud. "You've got this, Sam. Just remember you're not walking into that room alone. You're carrying every note, every story, every voice that's ever been silenced. Play for them." The night before the recital, Samantha sat at her piano, the metronome ticking steadily beside her. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, its quiet beats syncing with her breath. Her pulse. She closed her eyes and let the music rise within her. Not a performance, not a show, but a truth she was ready to share. For the first time in weeks, the tension in her chest loosened, replaced by a calm, quiet determination. The battle ahead was hers to claim, not as a plea for acceptance but as a declaration of presence. She wasn't just preparing to play. She was preparing to speak in the only language that could carry her truth beyond the walls of exclusion. Samantha Linwood sat poised at the piano bench, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her gown, a simple black with no embellishments, mirrored the clarity of her intent. The murmur of the crowd faded as she lifted her gaze, not to the audience, but to the keys. She breathed once, twice, feeling the weight of every eye upon her, the invisible thread connecting her to every moment that had led to this one. The humiliation, the isolation, the quiet resilience. Big Shaq stood at the back of the hall, his arms crossed, his face a steady mask of quiet pride. He wasn't here as a spectacle. He was here as witness to Samantha's truth. His gaze locked on hers, as she exhaled and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note rang out, clear and resonant, slicing through the hushed anticipation with a boldness that demanded attention. It wasn't a practiced, pristine tone. It was raw, slightly rough at the edges, human, and it was her. The melody unfolded with a deliberate intensity, a weaving of classical structure and jazz-infused improvisation, of sharp rhythms and soulful dips. Samantha's hands moved with purpose, shaping phrases that told a story beyond technical precision, a story of struggle, of silence, of refusal to be diminished. The audience, accustomed to perfection polished to sterility, found themselves leaning forward, drawn by the honesty in her sound. The music wasn't asking for approval, it was declaring presence. Lucian Drexler sat near the front, his polished exterior intact, though his fingers tapped restlessly against the arm of his chair. His jaw tightened as Samantha's performance deepened, the layers of her music revealing themselves like pages in a diary he had no right to read. He had underestimated her resilience, her capacity to turn pain into power, silence into sound. He could feel the audience's shift, the subtle but unmistakable recalibration of respect. No one was looking at him, they were listening to her. Samantha's piece built toward a crescendo, her hands flying across the keys, the notes cascading like a waterfall of emotion. The tension in the hall tightened, a collective intake of breath as the music rose, dipped, then soared into an unexpected key change, a musical sleight of hand that left listeners breathless. She wasn't merely playing a composition, she was telling a story too intricate for words, a truth too profound to be denied. Her final chord was not a triumphant crash, but a lingering resonant note that hovered in the air, refusing to be dismissed. The silence that followed was absolute, the audience suspended in the space between sound and breath. Then, as if released from a spell, the applause erupted. Not the polite, measured clapping of cultural obligation, but a genuine rising tide of appreciation. It swelled into a standing ovation, the audience on its feet, some with tears in their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had witnessed. Lucian remained seated, his hands resting limply in his lap. His expression was carefully composed, but his eyes betrayed him, the flicker of something hollow beneath the surface. He couldn't refute what they had heard, the narrative he had crafted so meticulously, of Samantha as a manufactured prodigy propped up by sentiment, had been dismantled note by note. The truth of her music stood unchallenged, louder than any op-ed, clearer than any whispered dismissal. At the piano, Samantha's hands dropped to her lap, her shoulders rising and falling with the release of held breath. She glanced up, not seeking approval, but acknowledging the space she had claimed. Her gaze met Shaq's across the hall, his subtle nod a shared recognition of victory, not measured in applause, but in the reclamation of voice. For the first time since Ellington Hall had witnessed her silence, she had spoken on her own terms, and the walls seemed to hum with the resonance of that declaration. As the ovation continued, Samantha rose from the bench, her movements unhurried, graceful. She inclined her head in a quiet gesture of gratitude, not just to the audience, but to the journey that had brought her here, to the truths uncovered in every hesitant note, every moment of doubt, transformed into defiance. The metronome Shaq had given her sat discreetly on a nearby table, its silent rhythm a reminder that this performance was not an endpoint, but a beginning. Lucian remained seated as the applause surged around him, his presence shrinking in the face of the music's undeniable impact. His allies exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting in their seats, others clapping hesitantly as if realizing too late which side of history they stood on. The power Lucian once wielded with impunity was, in this moment, rendered powerless by the raw, unapologetic truth of a girl he had tried to silence. As Samantha exited the stage, her head held high, the applause followed her like a tide. Shaq met her at the wings, his smile quiet but radiant. That, he said softly, was everything. Samantha's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. It was just the beginning. And as they stepped into the corridor beyond the stage, the echo of her music lingered, a resonance that could not be dismissed, a truth that no gatekeeper could ever silence. The building that housed Unspoken was unassuming from the outside, a converted warehouse nestled between narrow streets, where the city's heartbeat hummed quietly, but inside it pulsed with life, with the vibrant energy of sound and the hopeful cadence of transformation. Samantha Linwood stood just beyond the entrance, her gaze sweeping over the space she and Big Shaq had built, brick by quiet brick, into something that transcended mere walls and a name. The rehearsal rooms were filled with musicians, young and old, polished and raw, each carving out melodies that spoke of lives often overlooked by the grandeur of the mainstream. The walls were adorned with framed photographs, not of celebrities but of the students and mentors who made this space a sanctuary. The name Unspoken glowed softly above the entrance, a testament to the music that had always existed between the lines, in the margins, in the silence forced upon too many. Shaq stood nearby, his massive frame blending into the background of laughter and clattering instruments. He watched Samantha with quiet pride, his arms folded across his chest, his expression relaxed but alert. The lines around his eyes had deepened, carved by countless moments of mentorship and resilience, but his spirit remained as steady as the metronome he had gifted her months before. Now it sat on a shelf in the main hall, ticking steadily, a symbol of rhythm reclaimed. "You ever think we'd get here?" Shaq's voice rumbled softly, breaking the hush, as Samantha joined him. Samantha's smile was small but luminous, her fingers brushing against the piano key embedded into the Unspoken logo, like a secret signature. "Honestly," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering, "some days I didn't think I'd get anywhere, but now it feels like the music found a way to keep playing, even when I couldn't." Their vision for Unspoken wasn't born from grand declarations, but from a shared understanding of what it meant to be unheard, unseen, dismissed. It wasn't just a music school, it was a haven for those who had been excluded. A space where mentorship was measured not in perfection but in presence, where creativity was allowed to be messy and loud, and imperfectly honest. Here every note mattered because every story mattered. As they watched the musicians practice, a girl with a violin that wavered, but carried truth, a boy at the keyboard threading beats into something fresh. Samantha felt a peace settle over her, not the finality of an ending, but the quiet foundation of something beginning. This was the legacy she hadn't dared to imagine when she first stepped onto the stage at Ellington Hall. Not applause, not accolades, but a space where others could find their voice, their rhythm, their unspoken truths. Word of Unspoken's opening had spread quietly, but purposefully. Musicians from across the city and beyond had reached out, sharing stories of exclusion and quiet defiance. Parents brought children who'd been turned away from more prestigious institutions. Retired performers offered to mentor, their wisdom born not of easy triumphs but of battles hard won in shadows. Each day, Unspoken grew, not in grandeur but in depth and meaning. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Samantha recognized the handwriting immediately. Precise, almost too neat, familiar in a way that made her breath hitch. She opened it slowly, her fingers tracing the lines of text with cautious curiosity. Lucian's words were not grandiose. The letter was brief, unadorned, and at its center was a simple acknowledgement. I was wrong. He wrote not of excuses, not of veiled justifications, but of realization, a quiet reckoning that had arrived too late for him to salvage the authority he once wielded, but not too late to offer a fragment of honesty. Enclosed with the letter was a new composition, handwritten, its notes precise yet tentative, as though testing their own sound in an unfamiliar world. Samantha read the letter twice, then set it aside. She didn't reply, not because she held on to bitterness. There was no room for that now. But because the music, more than the words, spoke what needed to be said. She placed the composition on the piano in the main hall of Unspoken, where others could see, where the lines between exclusion and inclusion blurred into shared rhythm. In the weeks that followed, Samantha continued to teach, to play, to build. She found herself less consumed by the need to be seen, and more driven by the desire to create spaces where others could see themselves. The applause she'd once craved no longer echoed as loudly in her mind. Instead, it was replaced by the quiet satisfaction of watching a student grasp a challenging passage, of hearing a young composer find a melody that resonated with their truth. Shaq remained a constant presence, not as a figurehead, but as a mentor, a friend, a witness to the unfolding narrative they had co-written. Occasionally, he'd pull her aside during rehearsals, murmuring, "Don't forget your own song," a gentle reminder that her story wasn't finished, that her voice still had more to say. One evening, as the sun cast long shadows across the practice rooms, and the hum of instruments gave way to quiet conversations, Samantha sat alone at the piano. Her fingers moved lightly over the keys, not with the urgency of performance, but with the ease of communion. She played not for an audience, not for a legacy, but for the sheer quiet joy of sound. The melody she wove was simple, but it carried with it the weight of every silence broken, every voice reclaimed. As the notes faded, she looked up, her gaze meeting the quiet expanse of Unspoken's main hall, and in that stillness, she felt it. The undeniable truth that music at its core was not about perfection or acclaim. It was about presence, about resilience, about creating space for stories that had too long been forced into silence. In the end, Samantha Linwood's story was not a tale of revenge or redemption. It was a testament to the simple, profound power of truth, spoken through music, a truth that no gatekeeper, no critic, no whispered dismissal could ever silence. And as she played on, the notes rising softly into the night, the walls of Unspoken seemed to hum with quiet approval, the music flowing outward, carrying with it a message that would echo far beyond its modest walls. A message of dignity, of resilience, of voices unbound. If this story moved you, don't just walk away. Listen for the music that plays in the margins of every life. Find the voices that are overlooked, the truths that are too often silenced. Keep your ears and your hearts open, because when talent dares to rise, it's not just a performance, it's a revolution.